Great. So I had to clap so that the machine then realizes that I hear something clap. Very well. It's probably easier to do without a pen in my hand. Okay, so welcome to our hallway, and I hope you enjoy your day here and you engage with Alston, which is the relationship between modern and ancient problems. I'm going to talk to you about demographics, about having babies, and this issue of having a baby for Rome. Which is really quite high up the political agenda. And I'm going to be talking about Augustan reforms and Augustan fertility. And I really am going to be talking about the two problems, the modern problem and the Roman Augustan problem. So we'll start off with what is the Roman problem? So the Emperor Augustus, who you always see lots of lovely pictures of, and this is a picture of Augustus in a slightly older frame, introduced a whole number of measures to increase marriage and reproduction. These were introduced from around about 17 BCE, and they were a major element in his political problem. There was a perception that can date back into the 140s BCE, that the Roman population was not reproducing itself. We see that in a whole number of sources, a whole number of reflections on the problem of families and childlessness as it was described. On what basis did they know that? They had a census, but the census was probably pretty rubbish at giving detailed demographic information. But there are all the sorts of quasi-data, the almost true data that point to this problem, seem to suggest that this might be a real problem. If you look at Roman families, you go through the histories of Roman families, you'll see very few families which have lots and lots of children. And I'll explain why, if the Romans were reproducing themselves, they should have families with lots and lots of children. We also see that adoption was used as a strategy when a family line died out. So if you have an aristocratic family line, they don't have any male children, maybe even female children, they tend to adopt from a family which has more children, more male children, but they still don't tend to have very many. 1, 2, 3, possibly offspring. Now that's a bit odd, because there is a general perception that pre-industrial families with pre-industrial medical care and pre-industrial knowledge of contraception, etc., had high reproduction. They would have lots of children, and they had what was called a high fertility regime. That means that women would have many pregnancies and many children. And this raises a problem. Why might the Romans not reproduce? Or why did they control their reproduction? And the secondary problem that we have to think about is what those Augustan measures that he put in, how would they affect or change the reproductive strategies of Roman families? Okay, so what do we know about pre-modern demographics? Well, pre-modern demographics, as I'm sure you know, were called high fertility, high mortality regimes. That means that there were very high death rates and very high infant mortality. So let us think about this for a moment. Let us assume that you are all of a similar age, which is probably mostly true. So you're all about, let us make this for round numbers, around about 20. That would mean 1/3 of you, very approximately, had not made it to this age. So the mortality ratio, if you were to go through this group, I mean 1/3 of you were not there. Life expectancy is thought to be around about 30, 35 at 1 year.
So to maintain a population, there had to be significant numbers of live births per woman. That would tend to be 5 or 6, which would account for women who did not have any births. So if, on average, a woman was going to have 5 or 6 pregnancies leading to live births, what should result from that is some families being lucky and having 5, 6 or more children growing up into adulthood, and some families being unlucky and having no children growing up into adulthood. And to emphasize this again, we don't see those families with 5 to 6 children. Now, in societies where you have lots and lots of children, these excess children, these children beyond, say, 2 or 3, are not a problem economically if you can find work for them. So in a society where there's lots and lots of opportunities for young people to go off and find work, then if you have more children, so much the better. You have more income coming into a household. If you decide as a pre-industrial family that you want to limit your family size, your options are not great. What you can do is you can delay female marriage. Men are almost unimportant in this discussion. But you delay female marriage so that women marry later rather than earlier. In early modern Britain, for example, women tended not to marry into their mid-20s. That meant that they were not having reproductive sexual activity until their mid-20s, and their ages of fertility, the fertility range, was therefore limited. But we know that Roman girls tended to marry very young. They could marry as early as 13. Average age of marriage was probably a bit later, 17, 18. And we also know, or seem to know, that almost every adult woman was at one point married. That seems to point to fertility maximization, and that the Romans should have big families. So if you've got women marrying, having sexual relations, one would assume that they would have lots of children. How would they prevent that? Well, they could not have sex, which would be one possibility. They could use contraception, and there are various forms of barrier contraception in the Roman world. I would suggest that you do not try that at home under any circumstances, because it would be very, very ineffective and probably quite nasty. And the other way of you limiting families is infanticide. So you could have the live births, but then you don't educate, you don't bring up those children. So that's the ancient problem. What about the modern problem? Well, and this is a problem which is actually quite current in modern political discourse, especially on the far right. What we're seeing at the moment is developed nations shifting from population growth to population decline, and that's happening really quickly. For population to remain stable, adult women have to have 2.1 or just under 2.1 live births. Keep hold of that figure. For a generation now, that's not been happening. It's not happening. Been not happening in Japan for a long time, seeing populations decline there. It's not happening in East Asia, and there are radical changes in Southern Europe as well, where we're seeing these reproduction rates, what's called total fertility rates, drop not just below 2.1, but below 2, and in some cases even below 1. Now you might say, well, you look at UK population, political debates about the UK population, I say, well, what's going on here? Because the UK population seems to be growing. Well, fertility rates in the UK have not declined quite so fast as other places, but they are now in very rapid decline. Also, the population expansion in the UK has been driven almost entirely by migration. It's driven by migration for two reasons. One, it's people coming in, so obviously you count those people. Secondly, UK being a relatively rich country, people are coming here, they're working, they're generating the income which allows them to get married and have children. It's also cheaper for UK government and UK industry to import workforce rather than develop the workforce. If you look at the figures overall, only Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Indian subcontinent now seem across the world to have populations that can sustain rapid growth. But even in those areas, those populations are starting to adjust, and the signs are that those populations will not cross that 2.1 figure in the next generation. Okay, so let's see if this works. If this doesn't work, I have a different table. Does that come up? Yeah, okay. So this is figures for the total fertility rates. Key figure here is 2. So that's the 2 line here. And you'll notice that all these societies have dropped well below 2. So we take the most dramatic case, that is China. So in China in the 1960s, you've got a total fertility rate of 7.5. That means on average, the average one was having 7.5 children. So women were having lots more. And that collapsed. One-child policy comes in, and you can see that that has fallen to below reproduction rate by 1992. It is now at 1.2. So the Chinese population of the last has started to fall, and over the next generations will start to collapse. Same can be said for the United Kingdom, which is now down to 1.6. Italy, 1.3, and Japan, Japan, 1.4. So population is going to fall. And that means when you start projecting the figures for population ahead, you'll start to see populations gradually falling. Demographers are so shocked by this, they don't think it's real. They think these figures are going to change and that the declines in fertility will reverse, particularly after COVID. COVID saw fertility collapse, even though governments kept saying, oh, everyone's at home, they'll be having more sex, they'll be having more children. That didn't happen at all. Fertility will collapse, and we've now got in some places total fertility ratios down by 0.8, which would mean population collapse. And there's another way of showing that figure over the last 50 years. Let's take an example of Italy. So the total fertility ratio for Italy is now down to 1.4, and a mother's median age at first marriage is 31.3. So women are delaying pregnancy, delaying reproduction, and are having far fewer children. The result of that is that population is projected to start falling now, and it is now falling in Italy quite dramatically by 0.2%. By 2050, the Italian population will have fallen by 10%. What's more is that it's not clear that this trend can be reversed. If you take 15-year cohorts of population, women population, kind of infertility bands, so the women coming out of fertility, 45 to 60, there were 7.5 million of those. The women who are in kind of fertile reproduction ages, of 30 to 45 are at 5.3 million, the next cohort at 4.7 million, and the cohort that's going to come into that group are at 4.2 million. So there are only now going to be, in 15 years' time, 4.2 million potential mothers to reproduce the next generation. The consequence of that is a rapidly falling population over the next 50 to 100 years. Well, we could argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. The green agenda, the way in which we destroy our environment, means we are very conscious of the pressure on resources. So if we have fewer people, we think we use that resources in a less rapid way. We might think that as the availability of labour decreases, you get more investment in technology, more labour-saving devices. You might also expect that as labour becomes more important, then you might get wages increasing. But there are also lots of negatives. You're going to have lots of old people who are going to need care. Dependency ratios between old and young, and those who are active is going to go right up. So more people are going to be looking after more people. Economic activity, young people. You may not think this at the moment, but when you start to gain an income, you're going to want property, you're going to want furniture, you're going to want clothes, you're the people who go out and run the hospitality industries, you're the people who spend money, you're going to disappear. All that economic activity is going to slow down. The result of that is that the economy, in spite of what all the major political parties have been telling you for 6 weeks, is likely to be a low-growth, no-growth economy over the next generation. And yet all our economic models, all the ways in which we think about economics, depend upon growth to pay for stuff. It's not the end of the world, but it's a major political challenge. Economic, fiscal, political, and social models are going to have to change to accommodate the fact that you are going to be a much smaller generation, and your children are going to be a much smaller generation than that generation that has gone. And what are the policy responses at the minute? Well, they come down to really 3 basic responses. One is shout at women, tell them they have to have lots more children and they're being selfish. 2, you erode women's reproductive rights, which we're seeing in lots of right-wing countries, not just in the States. And the 3rd is you provide some free nappies. Gonna work? No, probably not. What's driving this? We could go through lots of things. High cost of child rearing, late marriage, delayed career advancement, housing costs, vast in most of the developed world, low wages, the high costs of education, not just education at university, but the high cost of actually bringing your child up from prams all the way through to buying a first car, etc. The political solutions to that, potential political solutions, mass migration, taking that excess population from Africa and moving into those places which are losing people. High wage economies or high levels of social support for families do not seem to be part of the agenda and seem for other reasons to be politically impossible. So that's the modern problem. What about the Augustan solution or the Augustan problem? Okay, so here's what Augustus says about what he does. This is from Augustus's Res Gestae. And he says that when he was consul in 29, he revised the revised the numbers of the Senate, and he held a census in 28, and in that census he counted 4,063,000 Roman citizens, not one more or not one less. And then he performed another one in 8 BC, and that was 4,233,000 citizens. And then in 14, just before he dies off, he says there are 4,937,000 Roman citizens. The Risk essay is full of lovely figures, and it's an odd Roman document, and it has these statistics. But what that shows is that during the course of what we would call Augustus's reign, the population went up by just under 1 million. He's put that on his last statement because he thinks that is a brilliant thing. He thinks that he's done that himself. Well done him. That doesn't mean he's been a busy boy. It means, as he tells us, that he has restored many traditions of the ancestors which were falling into disuse and set precedents in many things for posterity to imitate. Raising the population was one of his great achievements. And he does that, he thinks, by emphasizing fertility and emphasizing childbirth in a kind of symbolic way. Anybody doing the Augustan image will have seen this, I hope. Yes? No? From the Parcis in Rome, the Tellus Italia Parcis frieze, whatever you want to call it. My point about this is not what the goddess is. Why is somebody sitting on a dragon, which you might think was another problem that you wouldn't have to solve. What is that swan doing there, and why is this cow so small? My point is, look at the nature going bang all around. There's cows, there's plants, there's vines, there's whatever, and there's a central young lady here who's got 2 babies who are pulling at her, and then you've got semi-naked ladies all around showing off fertility here. In his imagery, what is important? Fertility, return to nature, etc. The pressure then is being placed upon Roman men to marry and Roman women to reproduce. And this goes back to 131 with that horrible and nasty Quintus Caecilius Metellus Macedonicus making a speech, which Augustus then quotes, where he says, he's talking to men, if we were able to do without a wife, citizens of Rome, we would all avoid that nuisance. But since nature has so arranged it that it is not possible to live comfortably with a wife, nor to live in any way without, by which means you don't get children, we must make arrangements for our preservation, for the duration, rather than for our short-term pleasures. And this may be Metellus Macedonicus posing on what's that slide? On the right-hand side of your screen. We have to have children to preserve the state. What does Augustus think? Well, Cassius Dio, who writes the longest account we have of the Augustan period, devotes the longest speech in his histories to this very issue. It goes on and on and on. He tells us that Augustus taxed unmarried men and women without husband and offered prizes for marriages. It then tells us that he increases the rewards for children by passing laws. And then we have an issue where the people complain and stage a demonstration against the emperor, particularly the equestrians. He divides them into 2 groups, the childless and the fathers. To the fathers he said, you're a lovely group, you help the country, you give us empire, marriage is noble, well done, children are a delight, you're childless, your immortality, empire depends upon children, I love you all, off you go. To the unmarried, he's a bit less kind. Are you men or citizens? You don't perform the duty of either, you're trying to murder mankind, you're all murderers. You're abolishing your families, you're abolishing the city. Romulus, no less, would be cross with you. That might not be frightening, but that's the best he can do. He and his people seized foreign women. They were so anxious to have children, but you won't even marry Roman girls. This is because This is not because you don't like having sex with women, you like having sex with women, but you'd rather not marry those women, you'd rather have them as slaves. I speak harshly, but I need to make the city healthy. In olden times, men were required to marry and have children. You've been encouraged, but you failed to act. You've shown contempt for the economy, the community. Marriage is a duty. I mean, I know it's a pain, but it's a duty. And having children is loyalty to the state. Marriage can be disagreeable and painful, but the state requires it. You value Augustus, you love Augustus, therefore go off and reproduce. It's really romantic, obviously, and bound to work as a line. I can imagine all of you now going off in a few years' time and saying, should we have children when you're with your beloved? Should we have children? Yes, it's good for the state. And here we have a coin where he's advertising his grandchildren, Gaius and Lucius. So why not marry? Why not get married and have children? Why do the Romans refuse to do that? The Roman men refuse to do that. Well, there are all sorts of strange things happening. We know quite a lot about marriage patterns. You ideally get betrothed, promised marriage at about the age 10. Lucky girl. Age of first marriage of girls is 12, though most girls seem to get married a little later, between 15 and 20. And as I said earlier, marriage for women is pretty much universal. Male age at first marriage is around 25 to 30, slightly older for more aristocrats, which, if you work it out, means that girls are marrying men who are often 10 to 15 years older than them. Why is male age at first marriage delayed to being quite late? It's because they're marrying when they've established households, when they've established themselves in their careers, when they have the family resources, familial resources to bring up a family. The material also suggests gender-specific infanticide. So there are more men on a marriage market, even though they're older, than there are women or girls. That can only be accounted for if someone is intervening when the children are being born and fewer girls are being brought up. What's going on? What is the change here? Well, marriage in general is a positive for a Roman man because it means not only does he have a lovely wife, but that wife brings resources. Those resources are things like a dowry, land, etc. And they come into the household and they make that household wealthier. So women are bringing significant resources. The threat, though, is having children. Because Romans operate a partible inheritance system. So effectively, the number of children you have, each of them gets an equal share of the estate. So if Mr. and Mrs. Roman Senator bring in equal shares of money, if they have 2 children, those 2 children come out wealthy. If they have 4 children, those children come out half as wealthy as the parents. So if you want your children to have the same status, you want there to be only 2 children. Possibly 3 if you're pushing it a bit. So partible inheritance means that large families see a decline in wealth. So if you want your family to be successful into the next generation, what you've got to control is how many children you have. You've also got to control where your female children and offspring go and who marries whom, because this is the most crucial financial arrangement that a family makes. The result of that is that family formation is not a question of eyes meeting across a crowded dance floor, people looking at each other thinking, she is cute, he is cute, and then saying, Mummy, Daddy, look, I've met the one. It's about Mummy, Daddy going around finding the one who's got the right property, the right connections, the right associations, and can be married. So marriages are arranged because it's too important to leave to romance. And marriages are planned for years. That's why girls are betrothed at 10. not because they want to get married at 10, it's because you want to set up that relationship. That has consequences. All Roman families need to exercise control of the demographics. You end up with a pool of unattached young men in their 20s into their 30s, and a pool of young women who are married to significant older men. The result of that, in sexual mores of Rome, is flirtation and love, which is extramarital rather than marital. When Augustus comes round and says, you've all got to get married, you've all got to get married quickly, everyone goes, but we're planning this is really difficult. We can't do that. We can't have children because I've not got the money to have children. And these measures are bitterly opposed. These are the most controversial things that Augustus does. He brings it in 17. They're still fighting about it 15, 20 years later. All our evidence points to these measures being unsuccessful. Marriage was just too important a decision to do it just because Augustus said you needed to have babies. Going back to our other point, well, what if they have lots of children? Can't you send them out to work? Well, the Romans have a supply of workers, they call them slaves. So wage labour is not going to resolve any questions. Okay, so here are two problems. Modern and ancient. Reproductivity. The number of children a family has macroeconomic and social impacts. It's really important for how society gets from generation to generation. States need to have an interest in it. But all the decisions about reproductivity, all the decisions about how many getting married and how many children you might want to have happens at family and individual level. So nobody is going to ask Augustus whether they should get married. Everybody's deciding it on the basis of their circumstances. Those decisions are going to be sensitive to the everyday, going to be sensitive to the economic opportunities and what you think is going to happen to those children. People want to secure a good life for those children. And questions of reproductivity are a choice. Those choices, though, affect demographic decisions. And to make an influence on those choices, you need to change the economic and social fundamentals, which Augustus could not do, which modern states cannot do. So how do modern states respond to that? Modern states take a very Augustan view. Modern states posture, they shout, they say how wonderful it is to have children. So in the 1930s, fascist states especially, and this is a poster from Nazi Germany, value motherhood. Partly it's a way of changing demographics, partly it's a way of disciplining women, making them blonde and rural, putting them in blue dresses, and sticking them in ideal landscapes, etc. You can find posters of this from Italy, from Germany, and indeed from elsewhere. Not this time, because they're all mourning the election, but last time the Conservative hard right, the really hard right, had meetings that were all over this issue. In America, they're all over this issue. In Hungary, they're all over this issue. In modern Italy, they're all over this issue. The hard right wants to reduce reproductive rights, force women into having children, all for the good of the nation. Ancient history is sometimes good to think with. Ancient history allows us to engage with these crucial issues. Thank you for your attentions. And I leave you with a blog from Scenes from the Life of the Classics Department, which should amuse you all for lunch, if that's what you want to do. Thank you.